Hi, we entered into Genesis 49 today, and here on my 228th video on Genesis, I'm going to break the pattern I've been doing and not go over this verse by verse and word by word, because as we'll see, the verses and the words are incredibly confusing and inherently unstable given the rareness and uniqueness of many of them, and scholars vary all over the map on what's going on here. So rather than try to get into detail, I'm just going to do an overview of what this chapter is about, how it might relate to the rest of Genesis, and where we continue in chapter 50. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, here's the shape and no keywords, because there really aren't any keywords. The words are all over the place. In fact, some of the words aren't even clear exactly what they are because spellings are different and things. But we can see the shape, as Sarna said many years ago, basically chiastic, with the sons of Leah first, the sons of Rachel at the end, and the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah in the middle, with the Zilpah in between Dan and Naphtali of Bilhah. And that's about all the structure we have. Other at the bottom, there's a little chiasm that brings us back to the themes we were at, and this continues directly to chapter 50. So although I resist source analysis, and although I'm trying to argue throughout all the videos on Genesis that everything fits together well, despite the source views of many scholars that many pieces are from different times and places and inserted here and there, this unit of Genesis 49, at least 2 through 27, is plainly something else. But what the something else is, scholars continue to argue about. So let's look at some of the difficulties that make interpreting this chapter very difficult. First of all, how does it fit into the historical context of the rest of Genesis? Is it from exile, like the rest of Genesis? I've been arguing throughout that the Joseph narrative is from much later than exile, perhaps from the period of Ptolemaic Egyptian control over the land of Israel, which would make sense of Joseph being in Egypt. But people like Brett have long suggested it's from the Persian period before that, challenging the Ezra and Nehemiah view that you can't marry foreigners and have children from foreigners, with Joseph's Egyptian sons being claimed by Jacob as part of Israel. But there's no clarity. And as we'll see, one of the scholars, Crouch, to argue for exile, and she's absolutely certain it's from exile, has to play fast and loose with some of the evidence, as we'll see. So there really is just no consensus of whether this chapter is from the same period as the rest or from some other time, or perhaps internally is from a whole bunch of times. And perhaps some of these little sayings are old, much older. Some of them are made up by the author. We just can't know. What's the relationship with the rest of Genesis? It's unclear at best, given the many rare words and clear images. And that's one reason I reached the conclusion I've already announced, that we don't know. There's the idea of Joseph versus Judah, and we can see that in the structure here, because the Joseph blessing is long and the Judah blessing is long, and they're not exactly chiastically parallel, but just about. And the only reason they're not is because the sons of Leah are in their birth order as the sons of Rachel in their birth order. But certainly they're longer, and so there's some question about the relationship between them in this scene. But is it, as Crouch suggests, the northern Joseph tribes versus the southern tribe of Judah in the time of exile and the question of the return? Is it something else? A priestly Joseph versus a royal Judah? Although there's very little strong evidence for priestly Joseph here. The argument that's made, I think, is not very strong, and I'm not even going to go over it. And a royal Judah, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But if there's a royal Judah, that certainly goes against all the theology of the book of Genesis, which is explicitly and consistently anti-city and anti-empire from the very beginning. Is it as Joseph is superior and Judah's inferior, based on the idea that Joseph is a good character morally and Judah's an inferior character morally? But as we saw in Genesis 38, many scholars think that Judah is rehabilitated when he acknowledges that Tamar was more just than he was, and the idea that Joseph is somehow morally superior ignores all the evidence we've seen that he's a tyrant, making people starve or making people impoverished and not starve. And so that takes a lot of shaping to suggest that Joseph's inferior. So really, there's no clear consensus nor near clear evidence that the text has anything to say specifically about Joseph versus Judah. Next, number 4, there's an astounding number of words unique here in the Hebrew Bible or in Genesis, and extremely rare elsewhere in the Bible, leaving interpretation uncertain. And I won't go over all of those. I actually asked ChatGPT to tell me, and it came up with such a long list of words or lemmas, the form of words in here, that it was too long a document. And it's only 26 verses. So enormous number of words that were not clear at all what they mean. There are particular words that we know what they mean, sort of, but they can have many meanings. For example, Shechem in 49:25, and if you've been following my videos here, you might recall from Genesis 34, Shechem was the place where Jacob settled, and then Simeon and Levi killed all the Shechemites after the prince of the city took and had sex with their sister, Jacob's daughter Dinah. Or Shiloh, which is also a place elsewhere, but are these meant to be places? The word Shechem means shoulder. It's used as shoulder. Does it mean something else? The word Shiloh has many meanings, and do we explore what Shechem and Shiloh mean throughout the entire Bible, or which texts do we think are relevant to interpret what they mean in this place? Can you get the idea of how confusing this could be and how much work it could take? How about the relationship between this chapter and other biblical references to the named sons of Jacob, linguistically, historically, and theologically? And we're going to see in a moment that's a question of Deuteronomy, and we'll also see the question of which came first. There's also another one in Judges that I didn't bring up here. Sometimes they have similar words, but theologically they're very different. One scholar sees chapter 49 of Genesis secular and Deuteronomy 33 as theological, but is it that clear? Which raises the very question here in number 7, the relationship between Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33, Moses' blessings on the tribal heads. Notice they both come at the very ends of the book, where Moses dies right after that as well. There's a question of the structure. I already showed the chiastic shape that Sarna suggests, but others suggest it's simply a loose collection of sayings that don't really fit together. And there aren't a lot of verbal connections. There is a little chiasm at the end that I was noting, and we'll come back to that at the end of our video here. The relationship between the seemingly backward-looking imagery and forward-looking imagery. Notice in verse 1 it says, Jacob says, that I may tell you what will happen to you in days to come. But many of these scenes seem to be backward saying. So is verse 1 separate from the rest of it? Is it purposely inconsistent? We just don't know. Are we meant to hear Jacob speaking prophetically? Certainly many Christians interpret that way based on number 11, reading 49:10. I'll go down and show us that verse as messianic, at least how the New RSV has it. We'll look at translation in a minute. But the traditional translation, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his feet, leads many English language readers to hear that as predicting the Messiah. Why Genesis would predict a king who would save them from other people, given the antipathy toward monarchy in Genesis, is a question that many of those scholars don't ask. But we'll look at that in a minute when we look at some of the translation issues that are translation offerings that are involved. And then the relationship among the individual blessings, including ambiguous verbal links. There are words that connect some of the blessings, but is that a coincidence? Is that meant to show some link between them? The words themselves don't really show any thematic link, although some scholars try to construct them, but I don't think strong enough to make us take the time to look at that. So let's look at Genesis 49 and 33 here, and you can see by the colored names of the different the sons, almost all of them are here, although you can see at the bottom the Deuteronomy one omits Simeon altogether. I won't go over the details precisely because the language you see here is not necessarily consistent language. But notice they're both right around the deathbed. Moses blessed before his death, and at the very end of our chapter, Jacob dies. And so what about that? Well, here's a chart that ChatGPT generated for me, and I just want to acknowledge that. It is accurate to the extent that the verses in the Hebrew are right here. I looked that up to verify. But I wanted to use it to note, here's ChatGPT, seemingly neutral, although it's incredibly smart about the Bible in many ways. And yet notice that it assumes that Deuteronomy 33 consciously echoes the patriarchal model of Genesis 49 throughout. I asked it, what about the idea that Deuteronomy is from the time of Josiah in the 630s and Genesis 49 is from some later time? And ChatGPT said, good point, it could go that way either. But this is the way it made the chart. That was the default in ChatGPT to read this. And so you can see here a number of the verbal connections between Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33 around theme. And that shouldn't be surprising because these are some of the basic questions that you would think that an Israelite would want to address to his progeny. Blessing, fertility, military strength, security, rest, leadership, and authority. So whether those texts are related or not, those seem to be the themes that would certainly want to be discussed. And then finally, let's look at an example using Carly Crouch's version, who argues vociferously that this is an exilic situation and not messianic. And although I don't really support her argument about that, her translation showed just what the challenge is if we take the New RSV on the left column as if that's the biblical text. So let's look at just a few verses of this, and I'll post the rest of it, of course, at radicalbible.net. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. For whatever reason you might want to use that kind of vegetative metaphor for Joseph, I don't know. But look how different it is over here. Joseph is a son of the Euphrates, taking the word pere for fruitful as the river, because she thinks it's an exilic context, and so Euphrates makes sense. Once she assumes the exilic context, she interprets it in that way. A son of the Euphrates beside a stream, daughters walking along a stream. Branches run over a wall, or daughters walking along a stream from the same verse, for the same Hebrew words, I'm sorry. Let's look at 23. The archers fiercely attacked him. They shot at him and pressed hard. Or they resented him and contended. Lords of arrows bore a grudge against him. So is it describing an attack, or is it describing an opposition emotionally? Couple more. Yet his bow remained taut, and his arms were made mighty by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. So in the NORSV, Joseph is being empowered by God. But here, his bow persevered, the strength of his hands quick moving, greater than the mighty hands of Jacob, than the shepherd's name, the stone of Israel. Here, he's being compared with Jacob. Rather than being empowered by God, he's simply being compared to Jacob. And I won't go over all of these, but you can look at these yourself as I post them. And the second half isn't nearly as different, but verse 10 is important to look at. Because I noted the NORSV translation and standard English translations similar to that lead many to see chapter 49, verse 10 as a messianic, anticipating Jesus and interpreting it that way. But what if we hear it the way Crouch does? A rod will not turn aside from Judah, but that which is decreed is between his feet, a witness that he entered her skirts while she waited for him at Anim. And I won't go over the context of that, although she's suggesting that's relating back to Genesis 38, Judah's liaison with the hidden Tamar pretending to be a prostitute, since he entered her skirts. But look how different those are. The NORSV sounds messianic, and this sounds chastising. In fact, she sees verse 8 as positive inserted over what otherwise was utter criticism and mockery of Judah, whereas most scholars in the translation here makes Judah the hero of the story. So it really is quite a mess. Let's just let that be what it is and look at the final scene up close just a little bit. And I don't need to look at the Hebrew because there really aren't any important words that we haven't already seen. But I want to note how much this goes back to what we've seen and highlights that Jacob is insisting that Egypt is not the land. Notice that throughout the rest of the chapter that we just looked at, there's no mention of Egypt or any of the context of what we've been looking at. So we hear this. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, blessing each of them with a suitable blessing. Then he charged them. And we could say that then he charged them is part of the chiasm here, and this part, the first sentence, is part of the previous section. We can look at it that way if we want, because the charged them matches when Jacob ended his charge on the other side of the chiasm. And then he insists, bury me with my ancestors. We already saw back in chapter 47, you can see the verse here, where he said, bury me with my family, but we didn't hear the specifics. And notice how specific it is, sounding much like the legal terms we see at the end of Genesis 23 that you can compare right here. Bury me with my ancestors, or literally my fathers, although it's not just his fathers, in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave in the field at Machpelah, near Mamre, in the land of Canaan, in the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite as a burial site. All that detail in terms of who it was owned by and how it became their property. Notice he could have simply said where it was. He could have simply said the cave in the field at Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. Did they need to know it was the field of Ephron the Hittite, which actually it's not anymore since Abraham bought it and hasn't been for 2 generations? So they don't need to know that, but we as readers hear that, and it reminds us that this was the first claim on the Promised Land, not, according to books like Deuteronomy and Joshua, by a holy war against the Canaanites, but by purchase, by using the prosperity of the land to form wealth that could exchange things with the people of the land and provide access. So a much more peaceful way of entering the land, something that, as I'm making this very video, is at issue in the United States relationship with Greenland, of all things. Maybe by the time you're watching that, that's all been resolved one way or another. And then we see at the center of this little chiasm, there Abraham and his wife Sarah was buried, plainly not just the fathers. There Isaac with his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. Not Rachel, of course, because Rachel was buried along the road, as we saw. So what Jacob is saying curiously is that for all time, his body will rest with Leah, not with Rachel. Isn't that something? He sighed for the whole rest of his family rather than his beloved wife and the mother of his beloved sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And repeating, the field and the cave that is in it were purchased from the Hittites, highlighting that chiastic frame. So really, that's all I want to say about this chapter. If you have questions about individual verses, the problem is, even though I have many notes over here, they relate to questions of translation in Hebrew that I doubt most watchers of these YouTube videos would be interested in. So you'll have to go somewhere else for that. But next video, we'll start with chapter 50, the final chapter of the book of Genesis, and go back to looking at it up close. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.